against the Portland Trail Blazers.
No, not really a lot.
Finished second in the Atlantic Division, but their seasonal record was better than the Bullets.
Darryl "Chocolate Thunder" Dawkins broke backboards, invented an alien planet called Lovetron, and gave his dunks names longer than some box scores. He was one of the most joyful, most colorful personalities the NBA ever produced. But underneath the showmanship, Dawkins carried real professional wounds, from a violent night in the 1977 finals to a grudge over Magic Johnson that he was still arguing about decades later. This is the story of 5 men whose names run through Dawkins' career and his own memoir: Maurice Lucas, Bob Gross, Doug Collins, Julius Erving, and Magic Johnson. Some hurt him, some, in his eyes, failed him, and one became the symbol of a story he could never stand to hear told the way everyone else told it. These aren't grudges Dawkins ever announced in a formal ranked list. There's no single interview or press conference where he sat down and read off 5 names in order. What exists instead is something more scattered and, in a way, more honest. A memoir, decades of interviews, and a career's worth of documented incidents that, taken together, keep circling back to these same 5 men. Reconstructing them this way means being careful about what the record actually shows versus what later storytellers have added to make the tale feel tidier. Dawkins believed things. He resented things. He carried grudges that shaped how he talked about his own career for the rest of his life. That's different from claiming he drew up an official enemies list, and it's worth keeping that distinction in mind as the story unfolds. To understand why these 5 names mattered so much to Dawkins, you have to understand where he came from. He was drafted straight out of high school in 1975, a hardship case, because his family needed the money more than he needed a college education. That single fact shaped almost everything that followed. He skipped the 4 years where most players learn to control their emotions, handle criticism, and build a public identity before the cameras and the pressure really arrive. He walked into the NBA as a teenager, standing nearly 7 feet tall and weighing over 250 pounds. And almost immediately, people started comparing him to Wilt Chamberlain. It was an impossible standard, and Dawkins knew it. He wanted to be judged as himself. Instead, for years, he was judged against a legend. There's a version of Dawkins' rookie years that gets glossed over in most retellings. Just how little support existed for a player in his position. Today, teams surround a teenage prospect with player development staff, sports psychologists, veteran mentors, and media training. In the mid-1970s, none of that infrastructure existed in any organized way. A 19-year-old center was simply expected to show up, learn on the job, and handle whatever the press, the fans, and opposing enforcers threw at him. The Wilt Chamberlain comparisons weren't just an unfair burden in the abstract. They were a daily reminder, repeated by reporters and broadcasters, that Dawkins' actual performance, however good, was being measured against a standard almost no one in basketball history could meet. That kind of pressure, applied to a player with no college years to build confidence or a public identity, left him unusually exposed to whatever came next. The league he entered was also a league under pressure. The late 1970s NBA was fighting a public image problem. Television ratings were sliding. Reporters and commentators, often unfairly, painted the league as violent, drug-troubled, and dominated by young black athletes the establishment didn't quite know how to market. Dawkins, enormous and physically overwhelming, became an easy symbol for people looking for a villain. His response was to become something nobody could easily villainize. He invented Lovetron, a planet where he claimed to spend his summers practicing interplanetary funkmanship with his girlfriend Juicy Lucy. He gave his dunks nicknames stacked with rhymes and jokes. Stevie Wonder himself gave him the name Chocolate Thunder. It worked. Dawkins became beloved, but that same charm sometimes obscured how unprepared he really was, emotionally, for the pressure that was about to hit him. It helps to remember what the NBA actually looked like in the years just before Dawkins arrived. TV ratings had been sliding for years. Mainstream coverage frequently painted the league, often through a racially charged lens, as a sport overrun by drug problems and dangerous players. A narrative that landed hardest on the era's black stars, regardless of how fairly or unfairly it was applied to any individual player. Just months after the 1977 finals brawl that would come to define so much of Dawkins' story, another incident rocked the league entirely: Kermit Washington's punch on Rudy Tomjanovich. A blow so severe it nearly ended Tomjanovich's life, and became one of the most notorious moments in American sports history. Coming so soon after the Dawkins-Lucas fight, it added enormous pressure on the league office to clean up its public image, and centers and forwards built like Dawkins, tall, powerful, and physically dominant. became easy shorthand for everything critics said was wrong with the sport. The Lovetron persona did real work for Dawkins. It let him be seen as playful rather than menacing at a moment when a 7-foot athlete who could bend a steel rim with a single dunk was fairly or not. Exactly the kind of figure a nervous league office and a nervous press corps were primed to be wary of. Giving his dunks joke-length names, like the one that ran through Chocolate Thunder Flying and ended somewhere around Glass Breaker I Am Jam, turned raw physical dominance into comedy. It made Dawkins lovable on sight, but that same charm sometimes did something else too. It let people, and maybe Dawkins himself, treat his emotional life as a punchline rather than something that needed real support. A performer that funny, that colorful, could seem too easygoing to be struggling. The truth was more complicated. Underneath the routine was a very young man who had entered a brutal, high-pressure profession with almost no preparation for what was coming, and who would spend the next several years discovering just how unprepared he really was. That pressure arrived fully in the 1977 NBA Finals, when Dawkins' Philadelphia 76ers met the Portland Trail Blazers. Philadelphia had talent everywhere, led by Julius Erving, but the team's chemistry was fragile, stitched together from big names who hadn't yet learned to play through adversity as a unit. A 20-year-old center with no college seasoning was about to be tested in the biggest games of his life, against a Portland team built around toughness, discipline, and one player whose entire job was to make opponents uncomfortable: Maurice Lucas. If there is one name that defines the darkest chapter of Dawkins' career, it's Maurice Lucas, Portland's forward and enforcer. Every team in that era seemed to have a player whose job description included protecting teammates through intimidation, and Lucas was among the best at it in the entire league. He wasn't just muscle. He was a genuine all-star, a skilled and physical forward who happened to also be willing to cross lines that other players wouldn't. In the fourth quarter of Game 2 of the 1977 Finals, Dawkins tangled under the basket with Portland's Bob Gross. As Dawkins turned away from that confrontation, Lucas came in from behind and struck him on the back of the neck. It wasn't a shove, and it wasn't part of any ongoing exchange between the two of them. Dawkins hadn't been fighting Lucas at all in that moment. The blow came from a player who wasn't even part of the original confrontation, delivered to the back of his neck while his attention was elsewhere. The court erupted, fans, and according to the record, police spilled onto the floor. Both Lucas and Dawkins were ejected from the game. Dawkins was so enraged afterward that he reportedly tore a toilet clean off the wall in the locker room, a detail that has followed him through decades of retellings of that night, often treated as comic relief, rather than as a sign of just how shaken and furious a 20-year-old had been left by what happened to him on national television. That much is the famous part of the story, the part that gets replayed in highlight reels of classic NBA fights. But the deeper wound, the one Dawkins actually wrote about for years afterward, wasn't the punch. It was what Lucas did in Game 3. Before that game, in Portland, Lucas walked over to the Philadelphia bench and shook Dawkins' hand. It looked to anyone watching like a simple gesture of sportsmanship. It wasn't. Lucas later said the handshake was calculated, designed specifically to take the edge off Dawkins, to diffuse the anger that had been fueling his aggressive play. And it worked exactly as intended. Dawkins admitted in his own autobiography that something broke in him after that handshake. He said he lost the heart to play the way he had been playing. He stopped rebounding with the same force. He stopped defending with the same intensity. Portland won the next 4 games in a row and took the championship. It's worth sitting with what actually happened here, because it says something uncomfortable about competitive pressure at that level. Lucas hit him from behind, which by any measure was a dirty and unprovoked act of violence. Dawkins had every reason to be furious, but it was not the punch that took the series away from Philadelphia. It was a handshake. One calculated, friendly gesture disarmed a player who, by his own admission, allowed his emotional state to control his effort on the floor. That's not a knock on Dawkins' talent. It's a window into how young he still was, and how little the league or his own team had done to prepare him for psychological warfare that had nothing to do with basketball skill. Dawkins never fully let go of what happened in that series. The story that got told afterward praised Lucas as a genius of gamesmanship, and painted Dawkins as fragile, as a man who let his emotions decide a championship. He carried that characterization for the rest of his career, and it's easy to understand why it stung. But it also explains something important about the 4 grievances that followed. Dawkins spent the rest of his career sensitive to any suggestion that he wasn't tough enough, wasn't supported enough, or wasn't respected enough. Lucas planted that seed. Everything after grew out of it. It's also worth noting what this incident does not prove. Lucas's blow did not by itself cost Philadelphia the championship. A team does not lose 4 straight games because of one handshake. Plenty of other factors were in play, including Portland simply being the better, more cohesive team over that stretch. Lucas himself was a 5-time All-Star and one of the most respected defenders and interior toughness players of his generation. Not a one-trick enforcer who got lucky with a well-timed gesture. But in Dawkins' own mind, and in the way the story of that series has been told ever since, the handshake became the defining image of his psychological collapse. That's the story he lived with. And it's easy to see why a young player would resent being remembered less for what an opponent did to him physically than for how completely that opponent got inside his head. There's a broader lesson buried in the Lucas grievance that runs through the rest of Dawkins' career. He was, by every account, an emotional player. His best basketball came when his anger and his physicality were both running hot. That same emotional intensity, once an opponent learned how to diffuse it, became a liability. Lucas figured that out in 1977, and word of it likely spread. If a single handshake could take a 20-year-old, 250-pound force of nature and turn him passive for 4 straight games, it's not hard to imagine other players, coaches, and even referees filing that lesson away for later use. Dawkins spent the rest of his career fighting a reputation problem that traced directly back to that one Portland series. The sense that he could be beaten not just physically, but mentally, and that his effort could be controlled by someone who knew which buttons to press. Bob Gross before Lucas ever threw a punch. There was Bob Gross, the Portland forward whose tangle with Dawkins started the entire sequence. Without that initial collision, there's no clear path to the blow that followed the whole chain of events that came to define the series, and a piece of Dawkins' career begins here under the basket, with 2 forwards fighting for position. With about 5 minutes left in that same game 2, Dawkins and Gross collided under the basket. Dawkins believed Gross was initiating rough, excessive contact and getting away with it. Exactly the kind of treatment he felt he absorbed constantly around the rim without officials calling it the other way. He responded by throwing Gross to the floor. Gross got back up and called him an idiot. Dawkins answered with a wild left hook. The punch never actually landed on Gross. That detail matters because it says a lot about what Gross represented in Dawkins' mind for the rest of his career. The class of opponent who could provoke him verbally or physically, force him into an aggressive response, and then walk away from the consequences while Dawkins absorbed the fallout. Dawkins believed throughout his career that officials and observers held him to a different standard because of his size. At 6'11" and well over 250 pounds, he felt referees saw him as a football player who had wandered onto a basketball court, someone who needed to be watched and penalized more closely than smaller players who started the physical contact in the first place. There's real substance to that grievance. Dawkins racked up enormous foul totals across his career, numbers that supported his sense that he was constantly being flagged for physicality that started with someone else. But it's also true that being baited does not erase responsibility for how you respond. Gross used words. Dawkins answered with a punch aimed at another human being's face. Whatever legitimate frustration fueled that swing, the decision to throw it was his, and it turned him. In that moment, from the player who felt wronged into the player everyone would remember as dangerous. There's a pattern worth pausing on here, because it repeats across several of these 5 grievances. Dawkins consistently framed himself as the target of instigation, the player who absorbed the first act of aggression and then paid the price for reacting to it. In the case of Bob Gross, that framing has real support. Dawkins was the one thrown into a physical exchange he didn't start, insulted afterward, and then the one whose response became the headline. But the framing also leaves out his own agency in the moment. Being called a name by an opponent, however unfair, is not the same as being physically attacked. A wild punch aimed at another player's head is a serious escalation, one that Dawkins chose to make. The frustration was understandable. The swing was still his decision, and it set in motion consequences far beyond anything Gross himself experienced. The punch didn't even hit its intended target. It hit someone else entirely, someone Dawkins never meant to hurt at all. Doug Collins? That someone was Doug Collins, Dawkins' own teammate. Collins had stepped into the chaos of the brawl trying to play peacemaker, trying to calm things down before they spiraled further. Dawkins' wild left hook, the one meant for Gross, caught Collins above the right eye instead. The cut required 4 stitches. The physical injury healed. What lingered was what came after. In the aftermath of the game, Collins spoke publicly against the level of violence that had erupted on the court. He said, in effect, that basketball shouldn't have to look like that. To many observers, that was a reasonable, even admirable thing for an injured player to say. To Dawkins, it felt like abandonment. Here was a teammate, hurt by Dawkins' own mistake, choosing to publicly condemn the violence rather than rally around him, combined with what Dawkins felt was a broader failure by the coaching staff to defend him against a media narrative painting him as a brute. The whole episode left him feeling isolated, like a scapegoat for a chaotic night that the whole team had a hand in. It's worth being fair to both men here. Dawkins was young, hit from behind by an opponent, and thrust into the middle of a national controversy almost overnight. Wanting your team to defend you in that moment is an understandable human response. But Collins had just been struck in the face by his own teammate's punch. He had every right to say that the violence had gone too far. That statement wasn't a betrayal. It was an injured man's honest reaction. The tension in this grievance isn't really about malice on Collins' part. It's about the gap between what Dawkins needed emotionally in that moment, unconditional loyalty, and what Collins was reasonably entitled to say after being hurt by his teammate's own recklessness. There's also a quieter question worth asking about this grievance. What did Dawkins actually want from Collins in that moment? Not silence, and not necessarily agreement that the fight was justified. What he seemed to want was solidarity, a sense that his own teammate, even while nursing a wound Dawkins had caused, would frame the incident as something that happened to the team rather than something Dawkins alone was responsible for. Collins, understandably, wasn't in a position to offer that. He'd just been hit in the face. His statement wasn't an attack on Dawkins specifically, but in the moment, it must have felt like one coming from someone Dawkins expected to have his back above almost anyone else on the roster. Collins spoke out against the chaos that night. Someone else on that team, the biggest star of them all, said almost nothing at all. Julius Erving, that star, was Julius Dr. J. Irving, Philadelphia's marquee player, and in many ways the face of the franchise. During the height of the Game 2 brawl, as fans and law enforcement flooded onto the court, Irving sat down at center court, elbows resting on his knees, and waited for the chaos to pass. To Dawkins, that image came to represent something much larger than one moment of a fight. It represented, in his eyes, a failure of superstar leadership. Irving was the team's biggest name, protected by his commercial appeal and his spotless public image. While Dawkins, still just 20 years old, absorbed the brunt of the media backlash that followed. Dawkins believed Irving offered him no real public or private defense in the days after the brawl. And he came to see that silence as evidence of a double standard running through the entire culture of NBA stardom. The biggest names got shielded from consequences, while the physical players in the trenches took the blame and the damage. It's important to be careful with this one, because the record doesn't establish that Irving wished Dawkins ill or that his choice to stay out of the fight was some calculated betrayal. Sitting down rather than adding fuel to an already dangerous brawl might simply have been the wiser, more mature decision. Nobody benefits from a superstar getting tangled up in a fistfight. But Dawkins' hurt wasn't really about whether Irving should have thrown a punch. It was about whether Irving afterward ever stood up for him the way Dawkins felt a leader should. Whether or not that expectation was entirely fair, the disappointment was real, and it stayed with him. There's a version of this story where Irving's calm is read as wisdom rather than abandonment. A superstar wading into a bench-clearing brawl rarely helps anyone. It just adds another marketable name to the pile of players facing league discipline, and it does nothing to protect the younger teammate already at the center of the storm. Staying seated may well have been the more responsible choice for the team as a whole. But grievances aren't always built out of what was objectively correct. They're built out of what a hurting person needed in a specific moment and didn't get. Dawkins wanted, it seems, some sign afterward, in the locker room, in the press, in private, that his team's biggest star was standing with him, rather than simply standing apart from the mess. Whether or not Irving owed him that, its absence stayed with Dawkins for years, feeding a broader sense that stardom in the NBA came with a level of protection that physical, interior players like himself were never given. The first 4 grievances all trace back to one violent night in 1977. The 5th came from somewhere else entirely. Not a fight, but a story: Magic Johnson. The final name is Earvin Magic Johnson, and this grievance looks nothing like the others. Johnson never struck Dawkins. He was never his teammate. The wound here wasn't physical or personal in the way the others were. It was about a story, and about what that story left out. The story in question is one of the most famous in NBA history, Game 6 of the 1980 Finals. When rookie point guard Magic Johnson supposedly moved to center in place of an injured Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and single-handedly led the Lakers past Philadelphia to the championship. It's one of the sport's great legends. Dawkins never accepted it. In his autobiography, he dismissed the idea that Johnson actually played center that night, calling the whole framing, in his words, complete nonsense. His argument was simple. Standing in the jump ball circle for the opening tap doesn't mean you played the position for 48 minutes. He believed the media's love for that tidy, dramatic story erased the actual physical work being done in the paint that night by real centers, men like Jim Chones, Caldwell Jones, and Dawkins himself, whose rebounding and interior defense rarely made it into the highlight package. This grievance reflected something broader that frustrated Dawkins for the rest of his career. A league and a media apparatus that increasingly built its biggest legends around perimeter players and guards while the punishing, physical labor of centers went comparatively unnoticed and unrewarded. There's a legitimate point buried in that frustration. Simplified. Dramatic storylines do tend to flatten complicated team efforts into single, marketable moments, and the men doing the grinding interior work often do get left out of the retelling. At the same time, it's hard to ignore how personal this one stayed for Dawkins and how long he held on to it. He wasn't simply making an argument about how sports media tells stories in general. He was still fighting, years and even decades later, to overturn the way one specific loss, one he was directly part of, had been remembered by the entire basketball world. That's a different kind of grievance than the others. Lucas, Gross, Collins, and Irving were all tied to a single violent night that Dawkins could point to and describe in detail. Magic Johnson represented something far more diffuse, an entire storytelling machine, built by broadcasters, sports writers, and eventually generations of fans, that Dawkins felt had quietly decided which players' contributions mattered and which didn't. Magic Johnson never took anything from Dawkins directly. He didn't write the headlines or produce the highlight reels. He became instead the face of a defeat and a narrative that Dawkins couldn't undo on the court in 1980 and couldn't undo in the public record in the years that followed, no matter how forcefully he argued his case in his own autobiography. That kind of resentment says as much about how deeply the loss stayed with him as it does about the fairness of the story itself. There's something almost poignant in a veteran center, years removed from his playing days, still insisting in print that the popular version of one of basketball's most iconic moments simply wasn't true. It suggests a man who never fully made peace with being a footnote in someone else's legend. The physical cost behind these 5 names sits a career built on remarkable talent and undermined again and again by uncontrolled physicality. Dawkins was, at his best, a genuinely efficient offensive player. In the 1983-84 season with the New Jersey Nets, he averaged 8 points per game while shooting 59, 3% from the field, numbers that reflect real skill and real touch around the basket. That same season, he also committed 386 personal fouls and fouled out of 23 games, a total that sat just 3 games short of the all-time NBA record. Those two facts sitting side by side tell you almost everything about Dawkins as a player. He could score with efficiency most centers of his era couldn't match. He could not, however, stay out of foul trouble, and the physical toll of playing that hard, that often, eventually caught up with his body. Look at the arc of his career year by year, and the pattern is unmistakable. As a rookie in 1975-76, he barely played, just 4.5 minutes a night. By 1979-80, his 5th season, he was logging nearly 32 minutes a game and averaging almost 15 points, a legitimate starting center in the league. But his fouls climbed right alongside his minutes, from 40 as a rookie to well over 300 a season by the early 1980s. That kind of foul rate meant Dawkins was almost never able to play a full, uninterrupted game at his peak physical level. He was constantly managing foul trouble, constantly on the edge of disqualification, and that reality shaped nearly every minute he spent on the floor. Back problems shortened his career and sapped his effectiveness in his final seasons. By the time the Utah Jazz acquired him in a trade that sent away a young guard named Del Curry, Dawkins was 31 years old and physically worn down. He played only 4 games for Utah before moving on to Detroit. Curry, meanwhile, went on to a long and productive 16-year career as a perimeter shooter, a quiet reminder of how differently two careers, tied together by a single trade, can unfold. Dawkins eventually found his way to the 1988-89 Detroit Pistons, and in his very last NBA season he was part of a championship team, earning a title before his career came to an end. It was a fitting bookend for a player whose career had opened with so much unrealized promise and so much turbulence. A title earned not as a central figure, but as a veteran presence on a team that valued whatever he still had left to give. Step back far enough, and Dawkins' career looks like a case study in what happens when raw talent meets a system unprepared to develop it responsibly. He was pulled into the NBA at an age when most of his peers were still playing college ball, learning to handle failure and criticism in front of smaller crowds, and with far less at stake. He arrived with essentially no cushion, financial or emotional, and the league he joined was itself in the middle of an identity crisis. Anxious about its image and quick to lean on players like Dawkins as convenient symbols of everything it was trying to distance itself from. None of the five men in this story created that system. Lucas didn't invent the pressure Dawkins was under. He simply understood how to exploit it in a single playoff series. Gross didn't create the officiating standards Dawkins believed were unfair. He was just the opponent standing in front of him one night. Collins and Irving didn't design a locker room culture that left young players to fend for themselves emotionally. They were reacting in their own ways to a chaotic night none of them had chosen. And Magic Johnson certainly didn't build the media machine that turned one finals performance into legend while leaving other contributions in the shadows. He simply became its most convenient face. What each of these five names really represents then is less a personal enemy and more a pressure point. A place where the larger forces working on Dawkins' financial hardship, unrealistic comparison, a league desperate to manage its public image, a media industry drawn to simple and dramatic stories, all came into sharp personal focus. That's a more complicated story than a simple list of rivals, but it's also a truer one. And it helps explain why these particular five names stuck with Dawkins for the rest of his life, while dozens of other opponents and teammates came and went without leaving the same mark. What it adds up to. Taken together, these five names trace the arc of a career shaped by real mistreatment and by Dawkins' own reactions to it, which sometimes made things harder on himself. Maurice Lucas exposed how easily his emotional state could be turned against him. Bob Gross showed how quickly he could go from provoked to aggressor. Doug Collins represented the gap between the loyalty Dawkins wanted from his team and the honest reaction of a teammate who had just been hurt by his own punch. Julius Erving came to symbolize the kind of support Dawkins felt he never got from the sport's biggest stars. And Magic Johnson became the face of a story about basketball history that Dawkins spent years trying, without much success, to correct. None of these grievances were invented out of nothing. Dawkins faced real violence, real institutional pressure, and a real double standard in how the league's stars were treated compared to its physical laborers. He was a teenager thrown into professional basketball without the preparation college might have given him, carrying comparisons to Wilt Chamberlain that no one his age could have lived up to. At the same time, his own responses, the punch that hit his own teammate, the emotional collapse that helped hand Portland a championship, the fouls that piled up year after year, show a player whose talent was often undercut by his own struggles to manage anger and pressure. That contradiction is, in a lot of ways, the most human part of his story. Dawkins was mistreated by an opponent who hit him from behind and outthought him with a handshake. He was also a player who let his effort collapse rather than fight through it. He was baited into a reckless punch, and he still threw it, hitting a teammate instead of an opponent. He wanted loyalty from his team, and got instead an honest, injured man's public statement. He felt abandoned by his sport's biggest star, even as that star may have made the more sensible choice by staying out of the fight. He was right that history simplifies its legends, and he still spent years fighting a battle over a single sequence that most of the basketball world had already decided was settled. It's worth stepping back, too, and asking what all five grievances share, beyond the specific names attached to them. In each case, Dawkins is wrestling with a version of the same question: who gets to control the story of what happened? Lucas controlled the story of the 1977 finals with a handshake instead of a punch. The media controlled the story of Dawkins' foul trouble by framing it as recklessness rather than as a byproduct of biased officiating. Collins controlled the public narrative of the brawl by speaking out against it. Irving controlled his own image simply by staying still and letting the moment pass without comment. And Magic Johnson, or more precisely the story built around him, controlled the popular memory of Game 6 in 1980 so completely that Dawkins was still fighting it in print more than 2 decades later. Dawkins spent much of his career on the wrong end of narratives he didn't build and couldn't easily change, and it's not hard to understand why that left a mark. It's tempting looking back from decades later to want a clean verdict. Either Dawkins was a victim of forces beyond his control, or he was the architect of his own setbacks. The record doesn't really support either version cleanly. It supports both at once, which is a harder, less satisfying, but more honest way to understand a career. He absorbed real blows, from Lucas's fist to a media culture eager to cast him as a symbol of everything wrong with the league. And he also, at key moments, made choices, throwing a punch he didn't need to throw, letting his effort collapse when his team needed him most. That made his own situation worse. Both things can be true of the same person, in the same career, sometimes in the very same week. None of that erases who Dawkins was to basketball fans. He remains a pioneer, the first player to jump straight from high school into the modern NBA, paving a path that other prep-to-pro players and eventually an entire generation of one-and-done college stars would later follow. He was a genuinely gifted scorer, capable of shooting nearly 60% from the field in his best seasons, a rare combination of raw power and real touch around the rim. He shattered 2 backboards so memorably, with dunks forceful enough to bring the entire structure crashing down, that the league eventually redesigned its rims and backboard supports partly because of him. He turned his own intimidating size into something joyful and beloved through Lovetron, through his dunk names, through a personality that made a physically overwhelming player feel warm and approachable to millions of fans who might otherwise have found him frightening. He closed out his career with a championship ring in Detroit, a fitting final chapter for a player whose story from a hardship draft pick straight out of high school to a title-winning veteran more than a decade later was never simple and never should be told as if it were. Chocolate Thunder spent years wrestling with the men and the moments he couldn't quite forgive. But basketball never forgot him.